politics in order to get you guys fully informed for the 2022 midterm elections. Our presenter today is Allegra Davis Hanna, and I will let her introduce herself.
I'm Allegra Davis Hanna. I teach English. I'm the department chair for English at the Connect campus.
And I am just going to be facilitating this conversation today. I am Misty Wilson-Mertens, and I am the chair of social sciences at the Connect campus.
I wouldn't say you're just facilitating. You're a vital part of the process.
I didn't make the slides, though. So, Professor Hanna, tell us all about social media and politics. What does this environment look like to you?
So this is kind of what the environment looks like. So we have 4 kind of groups when we think about social media and politics. We have the companies themselves, so Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Nobody needs me to tell you what social media is. Political campaigns, so that would be the candidates themselves and the campaign staff who post things onto social media and also kind of monitor what things are happening on social media. We have political action committees, also known as PACs, and super PACs. So those are supposedly not affiliated with the candidates themselves, but they are advancing a particular political viewpoint. So we have sometimes PACs are dedicated to a candidate. So there might be a political action committee for Greg Abbott or for Beto O'Rourke, but there might also be one for changing gun laws or for specific policies or for specific issues. Also, lots of companies and industries have PACs. So, the tobacco industry has a PAC, probably more than one. 3M, the company, has its own PAC. So these are just groups that advocate for specific things that benefit them. And then we have users and voters. So that's me, you, people who use social media and get some degree of information about current events from the social media sites that we use. So it's really intimidating to explain what a PAC is to a government professor and a history professor. It's terrifying, but yes.
You did great. Thanks. So I think the thing that makes social media new in this environment is the algorithm, right?
Yeah.
Because we've always had PACs or political campaigns and we've always had voters, but throwing that extra layer in makes things a little more complicated.
Yeah, and so I'm glad there's no computer science professors here to intimidate me about this. So when we first got Twitter, because Facebook has its own set of issues, but Twitter is the focus of a lot of political conversation. So when we first got Twitter, you would follow people. And if I followed you, then when I opened Twitter, I would see the things that you posted. And it was really like the most recent was at the top. And if I kept scrolling down, I would see things from 2 hours ago and then from yesterday. And so that was a very, I don't know. That's sort of how we all think that social media works. If I follow people, then I'll see what they post. But that's not how it's worked for several years. We have these algorithms. The purpose of the algorithm is only to keep us looking at the app. That's its only purpose. So it has developed personalized relevance models, which the social media companies say, we do this so that you see more of the things that you like. So they tell you that it's to help you or for your enjoyment, but it's just to keep your eyes on Twitter and to keep you from closing your phone or from going to a different app. And so now Twitter decides what is relevant to me. So the very first thing I see might be from 4 days ago, but because it's viral or because it's retweeted or because it's got a bunch of words that have attracted my attention in the past, Twitter's going to put that front and center. It's also going to show you things from people you don't even follow because it just thinks that it's on a topic that you might be interested in. And so it's ranking them no longer in time, but in how interested it thinks you will be in it. And it's paying attention. What do you click on? What do you scroll past? What do you spend time on? And so it's learning as you use it what you like and what you don't like. And so it can feed you more things that you do like, again, to keep you looking at Twitter as much as possible. So it's just like a slot machine in so many ways. And so the this means that we are amplifying sources and de-amplifying others. And so who do you think gets the most attention? It's not the person who is presenting very reasonable, nuanced arguments, expressing a particular set of viewpoints in a very fair way, right? So it's gamed to get me to spend as much time as possible. And so it's trying to gratify me. So it's showing me things I agree with, things that are surprising, things that are going to make me angry. It's not going to be, it's not going to give me information I need to make me a better person by any means. Which
So
it's
that feeds you candy.
right. And it's not obligated to show me the entire political spectrum and to give me a representative view on every topic. Like, that's not Twitter's responsibility, right? I could, as a user, go out and seek people who have different perspectives than me and read what they have to say and educate myself in that way. So it's not that Twitter's job is to give me this very balanced, nuanced perspective on every issue, but it is, I would argue, kind of unethical to inflame people just to keep their eyes on your app so that they see ads that make you money. And so it's just constantly gathering data. So it ranks certain things higher. It makes everybody suspicious because politicians, commenters, people who post, pundits, all of those people, they all think it's everyone's perception that the other side is being amplified. So if I'm a Republican, then my perception is probably that liberal voices are being amplified by Twitter. But if I am a Democrat, then it's probably my perception that conservative voices are being amplified by Twitter because we don't, it's a mystery. And so we don't know how it works. And we tend to see a lot of things that are inflammatory. And so that means that it's showing me things that gratify me, which further and further develops these silos. So I'm just seeing information from people who agree with me. I'm just seeing information from people who Twitter knows I want to see information from, unless, you know, somebody posts something that, you know, if Ted Cruz posts something that's just like really wacky and everybody's talking about it, then it will show up in everybody's feed. But otherwise, it's just putting people into these bubbles um, because that's what gratifies people and that's what keeps them on the app.
And we kind of like our bubbles, right? They make us comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, some people like to, be angry and start arguments, and I'm sure you've noticed that happens on the internet. But yeah, in general, I want to dig deeper into things that are posted by people who I agree with.
And one more question about the algorithm. We do not know exactly what that looks like, right? That's proprietary.
Correct.
So we can guess, we can assume, but we don't 100% know.
Right. And that's why everybody, oops, I went the wrong way. And that's why everybody thinks that the other guys are benefiting because nobody knows how it works.
Okay,
And I think we're
so
just naturally skeptical.
I wonder why that would be. So what's the effect then on what you call the users and voters?
So, about 37 million Americans use Twitter daily. Which
That sounds huge.
Sounds huge. 22% of adult Americans use Twitter regularly. And so in that way, it kind of has a larger potential audience than the primetime cable news. So about 10 million people each night between 7 and 10 p.m. are watching Fox News, CNN, or MSNBC combined. So that's 10 million people. 37 million people are on Twitter every day. So it does have, in some ways, a very huge reach. And it has caused lots of changes in how we engage politically. So I can tweet at and about the politicians that I am voting for or the politicians that I am voting against. So I have, and it's not necessarily direct access because I don't think the politicians are reading everything that is posted about them, although some read a lot of it. But it does give me a forum for posting these things and engaging in that way. And for a lot of us, it causes more polarization because I can now get into groups, or I can't, because Facebook is famous for having Facebook groups, right? But even on Twitter, I can just follow a bunch of people who are using a particular hashtag, and we can get farther and farther into our respective sides of the political spectrum. And so it's not encouraging conversation between people who don't agree with each other, which again is not its responsibility, but it has a lot of power, and it's choosing to use it maliciously. Well, I don't know about maliciously, but selfishly.
For its own end and not for the greater good of democracy.
Exactly. And so 37 million people is a lot. And so there is responsibility for how you manage and run the algorithm that decides what 37 million people see on a daily basis. So that algorithm is kind of important because, even a newscast has people who make judgment calls about what is important enough to prioritize. And so there's no conscious decision making going on in the algorithm. It's machine learning. So,
another thing I think this does is change the way politicians give speeches or engage in debates, because they know if they have a good line, people will post it on Twitter
mm-hmm,
over and
mm-hmm.
over and over again. And so again, rather than nuanced arguments, you're looking for that line that's going to go viral.
Yeah, you're trying to memeify yourself. And so, a meme is very quippy, it's very short. So it has to be, like you said, not very reasoned, not very developed, no explanation. And so when we focus on things that are that short, which is kind of Twitter's, 240
Thing.
characters, right? You don't get a lot of information. And
I really like this sticker you put on here. I tweeted.
yeah, that's the other thing, and this might be on a later slide, is the other harm of social media activism and political engagement is people get satisfaction from doing something on the internet. And so then they're less likely to do something in the real world. So they retweet a politician. And so then they feel like they helped engage in a campaign. And so they're less likely to donate, and they're less likely to volunteer for a campaign. So, and of course, knocking on 100 doors and talking to that many people probably has more of an impact than a tweet that's seen by thousands of people. So, real life activism is still more important, but clicking a button is much more easier, and it still gives you the sense that you helped, which is
I like your
problematic.
point that you're making there, which I think leads us into the next slide. Is Twitter reality?
It's definitely not reality. So if you watch a lot of news, if you listen to NPR, if you listen to people talk about politics on Sunday morning TV shows, which probably not a lot of people do, but people talk about conversations on Twitter as if they are reflective of the American conversation. And so it's just an easy place to go and get information and to see what people are talking about and what things are trending. But Twitter users do not represent quote unquote average Americans, because it's still a quarter of Americans are on Twitter using it on a regular basis. And so that is the same percentage of Americans who get their news from podcasts, How many people do you know get their news from podcasts? Maybe a couple. That's the same number of Americans, or the same percentage of Americans, who want their next car to be an electric vehicle. Same percentage of Americans who think that in the near future, we're going to need to take up arms against the government. And it's also the same percentage of Americans who pay for their news. So that none of those things describe what we would say is mainstream or average or typical, right? Those are all people who we would think of as kind of being outliers in general, right? So like,
So, somebody who has paid for the news, that's like a New York Times subscription, or
yes,
okay.
I don't just turn on my local news and watch the Today Show or listen to NPR, or read the articles that are free, but I'm paying for a subscription to a newspaper, or I'm paying for a subscription to, some podcasts you have to pay for, things like this. So you pay to get news. And we should all be doing that, because that's, otherwise their incentives are to be incendiary and to get a lot of ad revenue. And that's not really what we want news organizations to be motivated by. But the point there is that people think about Twitter as being where America's having a conversation, and it's where a fourth of America is having a conversation. And so it's not representative of how voters really feel. And so, um, if you get all your information about an election from Twitter, and then you go and talk to people in the real world, those two things are not necessarily going to be the same.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it has this way of coalescing people, because I can, as a politician or a political action group, or um, even just a person who's advocating for a particular politician, I can rally people and give them something to do. And that creates a group identity. So we're all going to um, use this hashtag. We're all going to harass these people. We're all going to, you know, and do something together. And so then we're um, forming a group identity and coalescing into these very distinct groups. And that is not positive for reality, because
I
then
thought
we
you
have,
were about to say we were forming a mob.
well, there are definitely mobs that form. But yeah, that's not positive, right? That doesn't have a good effect on how we have conversations and understand other points of view. And what from once a person gets elected, right? Then the job is about making compromises and having conversations and listening to people from all sides, and representing everyone in your constituency, not just the people who voted for you. And so when we polarize things like this, then it's contrary to what we want our elected officials to do once they win an election. But, most people are permanently campaigning now. So once your senator is elected, right? It's not like John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, we have elected them to be our senators for the state of Texas. It's not like they can say, okay, now we're going to have conversations about what all of Texas needs, what everybody here would benefit from. They're still campaigning because they have to be reelected. And so they're still trying to feed into this machine that rallies up these particular groups um, in Twitter and on Facebook and places like that.
So I think another really great point that you kind of brought up was that it distorts our view of reality.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's very clear with your next slide about just who we are.
Yeah. So this is from 2019. So this is not necessarily reflective of today, but, and this is not, do you identify as a Republican or a Democrat? Because a lot of people don't want a party identity, but a lot of people know on the spectrum, I tend to be more conservative, or I tend to be more liberal, or I tend to be moderate. So even if you're an independent, right? Bernie Sanders is independent, but he would identify as liberal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So 37% of Americans identify as conservative. So that's very conservative or conservative. 35% of Americans say they're moderate, which means that they're really in the middle. They don't have um, strong ideological views in either direction, or it depends on the issue. In some issues, they're one, and some issues, they're another. So they're moderate. And then 24% of Americans identify as liberal, which, would for the most part be aligning with the Democratic Party. And you see that there's some change, but not a lot of change over time. One thing that has changed since 1992 is that we have far fewer people who identify as moderate. So people are becoming more entrenched in one party or the other, but it's still about, a third, and less than a third. So it's not much different I mean, this is just going back to 1992, but that's how we break up um, just Americans overall. But that's not who's on Twitter. So again, we have 24% of Americans identify as liberal, and there are far more people on Twitter who identify that way. And so the percentages, the breakdown is not the same. You see about 67% of people on Twitter have been identified as liberal or left leaning. Only 8% of people there identifying as moderate conservatives, and 25% extreme. So there's a lot of interesting things about this. One is there's far fewer just Republicans or conservatives in general on Twitter than there are in America, right? So the percentages here are not the same. And you could say moderates are people who are in the middle there. And these people are not looking at the same information as each other. So the people who are in those two extremes, so the 10% on the extreme left and the 25% on the extreme right, they are getting their information from highly or heavily biased sources that are opinionated, sources that cherry pick information to provide a false impression, people who are spinning stories to make some people look good or some people look bad. So those people on the extremes are not getting their information from, let's say, reliable, good sources. The people in the center are all getting information from the same set of news sources. So the people on center left and the people on center right, they're reading the same news stories from the Dallas Morning News or the New York Times or the Washington Post. They're getting the same information, and they feel differently about it based on their values and their experiences and their feelings on particular topics or issues. So those people in the center, I'm getting good information and I'm making up my mind about it. The people on the extremes are being fed a constant stream of highly biased, almost propagandized information. And so that just causes them to become more and more extreme. But the most important part of this is when we look at the political breakdown, there are far more conservatives than there are liberals in America, but that's not what's happening on Twitter.
So Twitter really truly is not reflective of American life,
It's
just
not.
looking at that.
Correct.
But yet we conduct political campaigns on Twitter.
We do it all on Twitter. What are you not doing on Twitter? Well, you're not
Having
doing anything.
nuanced, reasoned conversations.
You're not doing anything on Twitter. But political campaigns are very active on Twitter.
And that's a little bit surprising given that the small number of Americans that are on Twitter. But I'm guessing that they're active on Twitter because if it goes viral enough, it will leave Twitter and go into other spaces.
Yeah, so it does, right? So you have opened a different social media app sometime in your life and seen a screenshotted tweet, right?
Absolutely.
You see those all the time. So they're on everything else. They're on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. They show them on the news. So they say so and so tweeted this today. And so it does leak into all of our other information sources. And, that's hugely problematic because anybody can post anything on Twitter. Some things get taken down if they're, inflammatory, legal, hate speech. Those things will get taken down, but I can lie on Twitter all day long. And so, but the other thing about political campaigns is the people who are on Twitter are the people who are engaged in those conversations. So in some ways, it's your target audience.
Right.
So some people have used Twitter or social media to become prominent. So previously kind of unknown candidates have been able to tweet things or post things that are so um, enticing that they have become nationally known political figures.
I like that word choice.
Which one? Enticing?
Enticing.
Yeah. So, sometimes it's for good things, but usually it's for things that we would consider outside of the normal spectrum of human interaction. So they post things that you are bonkers. And so that gets them a lot of attention, and then they have attention, so they continue to say things, and that gets them more attention, so they feed that machine. The same way an influencer becomes popular on YouTube, it's the exact same model, but they're using it as a politician. And there are several people who are currently holding national office who rose to prominence in that way.
I like that idea, political influencer. That's a good way
That's
to think about this. I mean, I don't think it's a
yes.
good thing. I think it's a good way to conceptualize this.
Yeah, and because of that algorithm, the people who have the big personalities are the people who get rewarded in terms of more followers, more engagement, more people seeing your tweets. And so even something as apolitical as when Beta was skateboarding through a Whataburger parking lot, right? So that's not even political, but
Right.
it was viral for a long time because it was just like extremely Texas and just like a cool thing to see a politician skateboarding, right? And so even things like that aren't political, they can get you some engagement because they're interesting and there's personality there. And so, but it's also lots of nefarious, right? Posting conspiracy theories will get you more views. Retweeting people who are super controversial will get you lots of views. And as you get people talking about you, then you become more prominent. The actual tweets from people who are serving in Congress or serving in elected office, very small percentage of the political content on Twitter. It's mostly people talking about politics. So it's not actually politicians or people holding elected office who are doing all of this tweeting. It's mostly um, us talking about them and them having a few things to say. But the important thing to remember about Twitter is that, again, I can say anything. So if I am a Congress person or I want to become one, and I am trying to become a political influencer, I can retweet just really bananas conspiracy theories. And I can upload videos of myself giving a speech, repeating things that are inaccurate or not fairly representative of the truth. And there is no obligation on Twitter to fact check or provide objectivity. Now, you have probably seen that sometimes things posted will get a little notice that says, this contains information that has been found by other sources to not be true or something like that. And so that happened a lot when the coronavirus was really rampant and people were posting things that were, like terrible advice on in terms of health. And so they would put the little warning, little content warning that said, this might not be true, basically. Um, but that doesn't deter people from reading it. And in many cases, you can spin that and say, look, I got Twitter to flag my content because they're trying to hide the truth. And so it's like a badge of honor in some cases. And if you're a person who gets swept up in conspiracy theories, then you might as well believe the conspiracy theory that Twitter's out to get you. So when we bypass traditional media, there is no fact checking and there is no objectivity. And so it's great that we have direct means of communication, but it's not great, not great that there's no mediation there.
Well, and it seems like the system rewards people who are good at social media, good at causing a stir, but doesn't necessarily reward people who just keep their heads down and get the job done.
Right. And so if you think about a politician like Mitt Romney,
Mm-hmm.
who, regardless of whether you agree with his political beliefs, right, he's just a person who goes to work and does legislative work and lobbies for particular causes and tries to vote for and against specific things. He's not a super exciting personality, right? And in the public sphere. And so nobody talks about him on Twitter. He doesn't get retweeted on a daily basis. And so um, he doesn't get a lot of engagement that way. And that's fine because he has a different approach to engagement. But a person like Marjorie Taylor Greene spends a lot of time and energy trying to get engagement on Twitter and social media because that is her approach. And so, um, exactly, Twitter is not rewarding Mitt Romney for his industriousness.
Right. And maybe because he is a known political quantity, he doesn't have to do this.
Right.
Whereas if you're a newcomer, maybe you see this as how you get your foot in the door.
Exactly. I mean, that's why it's so much like being an influencer, right? So if I'm not a person who's already famous for being an actor or a model or a comedian, how do I become famous? I post increasingly wild stuff on the internet until it gets traction, and then I get followers, and then that is how I make a name for myself. Same thing that influencers do.
Do you remember when we thought the internet was going to cure all social evils? Do you remember that? It
Had
was
the
nice.
potential. It did.
It was
But
nice.
but then capitalism.
So
So
tell me
speaking
about capitalism.
speaking of capitalism, Twitter makes money from ads. Twitter doesn't make money any other way. And so, interestingly, Twitter has banned political ads from politicians themselves and from political action committees. So I cannot, if I'm running for office, buy advertising on Twitter that says vote for me. And I can't pay Twitter to promote um, my tweets that say vote for me as a politician. Facebook and Instagram have different rules. They allow ads, but not in the 2 weeks preceding an election because they don't want to. I don't know exactly what the reasoning is for that. All those groups, of course, can post tweets, and so in some ways that that might have backfired because if I'm running for office, I can't pay Twitter to promote my tweet, which just means that it's going to push it out to people didn't who don't follow me and who have no other reason to see it except Twitter is putting it on their timelines because I'm paying them to. So it's a promoted tweet. I can't do that if I'm a politician running for office. So in order to show up in people's feeds, I have to create something that would be interesting enough to go viral. And so I don't know, that to me that's sort of a backfire because that's just encouraging people who want to get seen some other way. But there's of course lots of benefits for not allowing political ads and for staying out of that arena of political influence. Interestingly enough, Twitter has its own political action committee. So it has its own PAC, the Twitter PAC. That's a thing that exists.
That shouldn't be surprising, but it's something you would not think about.
Yeah, so that means that they raise money um, and they make contributions to political campaigns and they advocate for legislation that would positively benefit them. So they're definitely not trying to stay out of the political conversation. They're just trying to seem like they're trying to stay out of the political conversation, but they're still raising money, making political contributions, and advocating for themselves.
Which, I
And in
mean,
ad
I
and
guess when you think about it, you would expect them to do that.
yes, You would expect them to. You don't have to like it though.
Mhm.
And again, those social media posts, including on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram, there's some fact checking. So if I say something like, drinking Coca-Cola cures the coronavirus, it's going to get flagged pretty quickly. And so the initial comment that gets put on it is, you know, this contains information about COVID-19. To get accurate, up-to-date information, check the CDC or something like that. That gets put anytime it sees any word related to COVID or coronavirus, it immediately puts that kind of notification on the post. And Instagram is pretty interesting because even if you take a screenshot of words, it still is reading what the words in that screenshot say. And so it will say, you know, check the CDC for information on coronavirus. But once somebody flags my completely outrageous tweet that says Coca-Cola cures coronavirus, then they're going to put a different notification on it that says this has information that is untrue or has no verification. In some cases, they're going to cover up my post with the notification, and a person would have to dismiss the notification in order to see the post. And sometimes it gets deleted. So there is fact checking. And they do try to put up some safeguards because, in March of 2020, people were posting truly outrageous things
Right.
about COVID. And so they put these things in place to immediately flag them and then to have them reviewed. But if I say things, if I say conspiracy theories, they will be fact checked. But there's no responsibility on social media to be objective, to say, yes, this one isolated incident did happen, but that does not mean that there's a widespread outbreak of whatever problem I'm trying to, if I'm trying to say crime is on the rise and everything is dangerous, and it's like, there's no responsibility on Twitter's part to say that's a misinterpretation of events, right? So we don't have that objectivity that the media is obligated to provide, which is why you should
So,
get your news from Twitter.
so in the overall scheme of things, is Twitter helping
No,
our?
absolutely not.
It doesn't matter what my sentence was, it just doesn't help.
It does not help. The only thing it's helping is your internal desire to be stimulated on your phone. So in that way, you get Candy Crush instead. So most tweets are not political. About 13% of tweets tweeted by US adults, about 13% of them are about US politics. It's not a lot. 97% of those political tweets were created by the most active 10% of users. So we are talking about a small group of people who can get amplified, and so they have their own algorithm for what kinds of things to say to get retweeted and quote tweeted and discussed and screenshotted and talked about. So most of those things are being created by a small percentage of users, and some of those users are probably not real people. They're probably bots.
But they figured out if we say this, it gets amplified. So they tailor their messages to that thing that's going to go viral.
Yes,
That makes depressing sense.
it does. And again, if I wanted to, if I wanted to sway elections or have political influence, and so then I could use that knowledge to post things that were incendiary and attract a lot of attention and get retweeted, even though they weren't accurate. And so this graph on the left, okay, is among people who say social media is the most common way they get political news. So if I said social media is where I get my information about what's happening in politics, I am most likely to have heard the conspiracy theory that powerful, rich people intentionally plan the coronavirus outbreak as some type of plague. Okay, so that's not true. But if I get my political and election news from social media, I am most likely to have heard that untrue conspiracy theory.
So you're not necessarily more likely to believe it, but you're more likely to have encountered it.
Right. And what's important to remember is the more times you see something, the more likely you are to believe it. So at some point, you see it enough times, you're going to start to wonder if it's true. That's just psychologically. If I tell you enough times that something is true, you're going to start to wonder if it's true. And so people who are getting their news from social media are most likely to come across these conspiracy theories. And that's just one conspiracy theory. There's lots more examples. And I don't want you to go overwhelmed by the visuals here. So on the very left, if you're primarily using social media for news, you are less likely to be able to correctly answer questions about current events.
I think that's funny because I think people who are very heavily on social media would believe that they had more knowledge than other people.
But because you're only seeing the information that you want to see, and because there's no way of verifying the information you see is true, and the only issues being, amplified on Twitter are the ones that are really exciting, which is not most of what's happening in the world is pretty boring. So if that's how you get your news, then you're less likely to really know what's going on.
But it looks like that's not the worst way to get your news.
Correct. The worst way to get your news is the local television news, like the Channel 5 at 5 news. Yes.
That's sad.
Well, they don't talk that much about the news, right? They talk about sports, they talk about weather. There's always, some type of feel-good puppy dog. There's some type of investigation story of some company in your local area that's fraudulent. There's maybe 2 to 5 minutes of news in the 30-minute newscast. And so if you say watching that 30-minute newscast is how I get my news, you don't really have a good understanding of what's going on.
What's the best way to be the most informed?
To read the newspaper. You could do it on your phone. You can get the Dallas Morning News on your phone, or the New York Times on your phone, or the Washington Post on your phone, or even CNN on your phone. But to read the news is the best way to get the news.
By a good percentage, it looks like.
Yes. And so the middle graph shows us the exact same thing. If you're relying on social media for information and for news, then you're less likely to be knowledgeable about key facts relating to COVID-19. Now, this survey is from 2020, so like the summer of 2020. So these people, if you're using social media to find out what's going on in the world, you don't have a very good idea of what's going on in the world, right? So these people were less likely to know who Anthony Fauci was. Only 50% of them knew who Anthony Fauci was in June of 2020. Only 50% of them knew what antibody tests were doing and how they detected the coronavirus infections in people. And far fewer of them knew what the unemployment rate was. It was 15%.
I kind of missed life before I knew who Anthony Fauci was.
Sure, yeah, but you did know.
But I did know.
But you did know who he was, right?
When it became important to know, I knew.
And so the other thing to note about these graphs is this is not people who use social media. These are people who say social media is how I get the news. So I use Twitter every day, as you know, of my life. But I would never in my life say Twitter is where I get the news.
Right, because you can get on Twitter and just you follow a bunch of accounts of puppy dogs or something.
Sure.
And you would not say that's your news, but it makes you happy and it makes you feel good, and you use Twitter.
Right. So
we're not conflating those two groups.
Exactly. And so same thing about how people felt about the 2020 election. The people who get political news from social media were the least concerned about fake news and misinformation and how it would affect the election. And the reason I included that is because the people on social media are the ones getting the fake news and misinformation, and they're the least concerned about it.
And that goes back to your point because there's no fact checking, there's no gatekeeping. So those
Exactly.
ideas can proliferate there where they cannot in other places.
Exactly.
So, how do we fix this and save democracy?
Just burn it to the ground. Okay. So, first thing to remember is that traditional mainstream news organizations are the most reliable sources for news. And so I know we say things like the lamestream media. And so we have some people have created this perception that the mainstream news has political biases. And most newspapers um, in their opinion section have an identified political affiliation. But in their news section, they do not. And so that's important to remember. But those organizations, imperfect as they are, have the obligation to be objective and to check their facts. And when their facts are wrong, they don't print something. Or if they mess something up, then they print a retraction. So they have the obligation to screen information to make sure that it's true and to make sure that it's representative of what's really happening. So they don't take a single news story about a single crime event and create the narrative that this represents a crime wave that's threatening all of us, right? And so it's not very exciting because it hasn't been designed to be salacious, but it is reliable. Now, cable news is an interesting place because cable news combines news and opinion. So if you watch primetime MSNBC, primetime Fox News, both of them, they combine delivery of information with delivery of opinion. And so they don't have the responsibility to be objective or to be representative of what's going on. And they can express their opinion and say something is bad or something is good. But a newspaper, a news magazine, CNN.com, those places are objective and check their facts. And most of the daytime programming on CNN is pretty dry, just news delivery. So those places are the responsible places to get information. And the other thing that you want to do is just look it up somewhere else. Even if you hear it on, read it in the New York Times, look it up and see what another source has to say about it. And so if you think that you are reading news that you just agree with everything they say, then you're not reading something that's objective. The other thing to remember is a lot of criticism about mainstream news is that they don't give you two sides to every story. But there are some stories that don't have two sides. Some things are true or not true, right? Some things are proven or not proven. And so the earth is not flat. So they're not obligated to print both sides of of a news story about the shape of the planet, right? The earth is a sphere, and so they're not obligated to say it might be flat. There are not two sides to everything. So just important. And finally, doubting conspiracy theory. So if something sounds extreme, if something sounds I'm trying to use a word that's not inflammatory, but if something is just like, oh my God, look it up somewhere else, right? So
before you send it out to everyone you know.
Right. And I see headlines on Twitter all the time that are just bananas. And so then I just close Twitter and I open a web browser and I Google it. And usually it's just not even there. Right. And so, like, if that were really happening, I'm pretty sure we would know about it. So, some examples that rich and powerful people created the coronavirus or paid to have the coronavirus created in a lab so that they could collapse democracy or collapse society, right? And so you can find that all over Twitter if you're looking for it or if the algorithm knows that you would like it. But it's not true. There's no information to substantiate that claim. And so we can't support that or make that claim. The same with widespread election fraud. You definitely, from politicians and from everybody else, not everybody, but many other people, tweet about widespread election fraud. But there is no evidence of it. And that's why they don't report on it in the news, because it didn't happen. And so there's no evidence that it happened. You can't have the opinion that it happened because it didn't happen. So that's why if you believe a conspiracy theory and then you say, well, the New York Times never talks about all of the election fraud, they don't talk about it because it's not true. And so um, that's how insidious conspiracy theories are, because once you're kind of in the throes of them, they can convince you that like I can convince you that there was election fraud, and even worse, no one's reporting on it because they don't want you to know.
And then
And
not
so
reporting on it is evidence of the conspiracy theory itself.
is
So it's
evidence
like
of the conspiracy theory,
a
yes.
self-feeding loop.
And then it's like, why is no one talking about how the New York Times is in on the conspiracy theory? That's another layer of the conspiracy. And so it will just constantly feed itself once you get somebody involved. And that's why it's very important from the first time you see the salacious headline to stop and look it up so that you don't get stuck in that pattern. The
So
truth
this
is just no country, government, organization, or news organization is sophisticated enough to take part in a conspiracy theory and not get caught. It's just not possible. So that's what I just remember about conspiracies. It's just like no one's good enough to carry that off.
So we are in the midst right now of an election.
Are we?
We are.
Just kidding. I voted yesterday.
So if you have not voted yet, this is your plug to go early vote. I highly, 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 highly recommend early voting. I voted on election day one time and I will never do it again because I waited for almost 2 hours. I
And
waited. I did
yeah,
do it, but 2 hours.
I waited 0 minutes. So you need your photo ID, but you don't need your voter registration card. You do probably want to look up where you're registered to vote, and make sure that you are going to. So if you can vote now in early voting any place in the county. On election day, you have to go to your actual precinct voting location. So is there some period of time when you guys have office hours on election day or something, Missy?
We already had office hours on the first day of voting to answer any
Okay.
logistical questions, like where do
Gotcha.
I go? But Vote Texas, go there. That can answer all of your
Okay.
questions just as easy. You do have until November 4th to early vote. If you have kids, go take them with you to vote. That's something
Yeah.
that we do so that you build that into your children, that this is just something that we are going to do as good citizens.
Yes. But don't let them push the button. They're not allowed to.
No, don't do that.
All right. So if you don't vote in early voting, you have to vote on November 8th, which is election day. And that is when the lines are long. I don't know if you know this, but people just tend to wait till the last minute for things. So
Yeah, but this is really one of those things where you want to just do it and get
yeah.
it done. Don't put it off because it could rain on election day. You could be tired. Just get it done early.
Yep. Agree. We have one more webinar this semester. And the other thing is we'll have webinars next semester, but we don't know what they're about yet, right?
Right. So I'm going to put a link in the chat, and then if you're watching this on YouTube, it will be in the video description. We'll leave that up through the end of this week. So please look there to get credit for coming. But one of the questions we always ask is, what do you want to hear about? So please let us know. In the past, we've done things on social media. We've done things on true crime. What am I forgetting? Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
So really, we do take what you guys want us to talk about into consideration, and that's what our spring program will be.
So on November 16th, we will be doing a recap of the election and just talk about who won, how counties voted, how different elections, what they reveal about changing demographics, perhaps. It all depends on how the vote turns out, really, is what will lead that conversation. One thing I did want to show, and I'll just leave this here, is the things that we talked about today. just barely scratching the surface of how Twitter and social media affect politics and vice versa. And so if you want more information about the studies that I was talking about, or the statistics that we went over, you can pause here and you can look any of these up. All of these you can access publicly. So even that academic article at the top, you can access publicly. You can read that LA Times article. The LA Times only lets you read one free article a day, I think. So that'll be the only one you can read today, but you still can read that article for free. And as Professor Mertens pointed out, there is a link to fill out. Make sure you include which class and which teacher you're attending for. And then, each instructor is a little different on whether it's credit or extra credit, when it's applied, if I put in the grade book at the end of the semester. So if you have questions about how your credit applies, ask your instructor, but just make sure you fill out that form. And on that form, tell us if you have a request for what we should cover next semester. Otherwise, the two of us will make it up and it will be really
Mhm.
boring. All
All
right.
right.
Thanks. Thanks, Misty.
Thanks.